Alexei was born into a family where money and power were an integral part of life. His father, Mikhail Antonovich, was the owner of the largest network of oil transportation companies in the country, which automatically provided the family with enormous wealth and influence. From early childhood, Alexei was surrounded by luxuries that most people could only dream of. He lived in a huge mansion with a swimming pool, a tennis court, and a garden where every tree and bush was carefully tended by gardeners. He had a personal driver ready to take him anywhere at any time and the most expensive toys, gadgets, and accessories he could buy. The boy did not need to think about money, because for him it was always in abundance. However, despite all these material goods, Alexei from an early age absorbed not only the atmosphere of wealth, but also something darker: arrogance, contempt, and cold indifference to others. Mikhail Antonovich, although he was one of the richest men in the country, was characterized by amazing simplicity in communication and treated all his employees with great respect. Everyone in his company, from top managers to janitors, knew that their labor was valued and that the director saw them not only as employees, but also as people. He often repeated one of his favorite phrases: "Every person contributes to our overall success, and without them, the company could not exist." However, his wise words, filled with respect for labor and human dignity, did not resonate in the heart of his only son. Alexei looked at others through the prism of their status and opportunities, not understanding and not accepting the value of those who did not have the same wealth and influence as he did. From an early age, Alexei showed a tendency to selfishness and cruelty. If in childhood his pranks could be written off as youthful ignorance, as he grew older they became more and more deliberate and cruel. He enjoyed forcing his servants to carry out senseless orders. He would make them scrub the floors several times, or suddenly throw things around to watch them frantically trying to put things back in order. It amused him to see people in a helpless state, and he had no compassion. His father repeatedly tried to educate his son, pointing out the importance of respect for people and their labor, but Alexei only indifferently waved away. "They get money for it, let them work." As the years passed, Alexei's character became more and more unbearable. His natural arrogance and lack of sympathy for others only intensified. By the age of 25, he had turned into a real tyrant, for whom only power, money, and his own ambitions were important. Despite the fact that Mikhail Antonovich sincerely hoped that his son would eventually grow up and become a responsible leader, the reality was much sadder. Having received one of the highest positions in the company from his father, Alexei did not seek to develop the business or improve its processes. For him, this position was just a tool to confirm his own importance, a way to demonstrate his superiority over others and satisfy his whims. There was real fear in the company. Employees literally trembled at the mere mention of Alexei's name. Everyone knew that any appearance of him at work meetings could turn into trouble for anyone. He could fire a person for the slightest mistake or for not liking the way he was dressed or the words he said at a meeting. Alexei was not ashamed of his actions and openly said, "I am the boss here, and I decide who can work and who cannot." In his eyes, this was a natural prerogative of his authority, but he did not notice how this approach was destroying the atmosphere in the team. People worked under constant stress, could not relax or take initiative, fearing that any action could be misinterpreted and lead to dismissal. Mikhail Antonovich bitterly observed what was happening. He saw his son destroying everything that had been built over many years, the entire reputation of the company that he had worked so hard to create. He tried several times to talk to Alexei, trying to convey to him the importance of treating employees with respect, reminding him how important it is to value each person's labor. But all his attempts were in vain. Alexei only snapped irritably, as if he was fed up with these conversations. "Times have changed, Dad. Everything is different now. It's every man for himself. If you don't get tough and take matters into your own hands, you'll be eaten." One summer, Alexei decided to take a vacation to take a break from work worries, although in reality he wanted to escape from the people he despised. He planned to spend 2 weeks at a luxurious resort in the Maldives, where no one could disturb him. In his eyes, it was the perfect way to get away from those insufferable people, as he often called the company employees. In the morning, Sergei, his personal driver, who had been working for the family for over 15 years, came to pick him up. Sergei had known Alexei since his early childhood, remembering him as a little boy who enjoyed running around the yard, fascinated by everything new, and was always friendly and helpful. In those days, Sergei often took Alexei to school, to various circles and sports sections. Alexei was then a curious and inquisitive child, always ready to listen to the driver's stories about his service in the army. He adored Sergei's stories and asked him about all sorts of details, from living conditions to military operations. But now it all seemed a distant and forgotten part of the past. In front of Sergei sat a completely different man, cold, indifferent, and arrogant. Alexei was no longer interested in stories or people. He cared only about his own ambitions and plans, and it seemed that nothing could bring him back to his former, kind state. The drive to the airport usually took about an hour, and Alexei, as always, expected to arrive on time. He didn't want to lose a minute of precious time, especially when he had a long-awaited vacation at a luxurious resort ahead of him. He had planned his trip in advance, from transfer to booking the most expensive rooms overlooking the ocean, and was sure that everything would go perfectly. However, fate had it differently. About halfway to the airport, the car suddenly got a flat tire. Sergei, an experienced driver, instantly assessed the situation and stopped on the side of the road, wasting no time. He knew that every minute counted and tried to replace the tire as quickly as possible so that Alexei would not miss his flight. But instead of showing understanding, or at least patience, Alexei instantly lost his temper. He snapped at Sergei as if he was to blame for the accident. "Couldn't you check the car before leaving?" Alexei shouted, barely containing his rage. "I'm late for my plane because of your incompetence." His voice grew louder, and his face reddened with anger. Alexei wasn't used to things not going according to plan, much less because of people he considered beneath him. Sergei, trying to remain calm, explained that he always checked the car thoroughly before every trip. In 15 years of working for this family, he had never once made a mistake and always kept an eye on the condition of the car. However, even the most reliable cars sometimes had unexpected breakdowns. It was just an accident, and Sergei did his best to fix the problem as soon as possible. But Alexei, blinded by his rage, did not want to listen to any explanations. For him, any problem was an excuse to blame the other person. He continued to shout, insult, and humiliate the elderly driver who had served his family faithfully all his life. Sergei worked as fast as he could despite the insults and humiliation poured on him by Alexei. The wheel was replaced in a few minutes, but to Alexei that time seemed like an eternity. When they finally reached the airport, it turned out that Alexei had indeed missed his flight. He arrived at the check-in desk just a few minutes later than necessary to complete the procedure. This was the last straw for him. In a fit of rage, barely restraining himself from making a scandal for the whole airport, Alexei turned to Sergei and, looking at him with undisguised contempt, said, "You're fired. Immediately. And don't you dare even think about asking for references or severance pay. You no longer exist for me." His words sounded cold and impassive, like a sentence. Sergei was stunned. He could not believe that just like that, after 15 years of loyal service, everything ended because of such a ridiculous accident. During all this time, he had never once given reason to doubt his professionalism, always doing his job with the utmost responsibility. He tried to object, wanted to remind Alexei of his devotion to his family, how many times he had been there for him in difficult situations, how many times he had helped him as a boy. But Alexei didn't want to hear anything. His face was contorted with anger, and he no longer saw Sergei as a human being, only the object of his irritation. "Get out of here!" He shouted across the airport hall, drawing the attention of those around him. A few people stopped and watched the scene in amazement, not realizing what was going on, but Alexei paid them no attention. With a heavy heart and a lowered head, Sergei left the airport building. He felt resentment and disappointment clenching in his chest. 15 years of impeccable service, many hours spent behind the wheel, care and attention to detail. All this had turned out to be nothing in the eyes of a spoiled young man whose life had been consumed by his own ambition and arrogance. Now everything Sergei had spent years building, his career, his stability, his family's future, was in jeopardy. He had obligations, loans, and a wife waiting for him at home, who relied on his earnings. And all this was destroyed in an instant, because of Alexei's whim, who couldn't put up with the slight delay and saw nothing but his own selfishness in front of him. Alexei, not the least bit embarrassed by what had happened the day before, headed for the front desk with his head held high, as if nothing had happened. He was sure that he was right, believing that he had done absolutely the right thing by firing the driver who, in his opinion, had failed to do his job. It was common for Alexei to get rid of people who didn't live up to his expectations. He was sure that his father would not object to his decision and that Mikhail Antonovich, being a man with great connections, would easily find a new replacement for the fired driver. Alexei did not even think about how important Sergei was for the family and for the company. He just went on with his business, trying to fly to the Maldives as soon as possible. When he finally managed to book a seat on the next flight, he went to the lounge area of the airport, completely immersed in the anticipation of the upcoming vacation. There was no room in his mind for doubt or remorse. Soon he boarded the plane and left the country, leaving no unresolved issues at home, as he believed. The Maldives greeted him with warm sunshine, snow-white beaches, and turquoise sea. Alexei immersed himself in the world of luxury and relaxation. He spent his days in a villa overlooking the ocean, pampered himself with exotic dishes and cocktails, enjoyed complete idleness. There was no room in his thoughts for work or any worries. He felt on top of the world, absolutely sure that everything was going according to plan at home. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, events were unfolding quite differently than he had imagined. The morning after his departure, Mikhail Antonovich, as usual, was preparing for an important business meeting. He was a punctual man and always valued accuracy, so his day began strictly according to schedule. From the very morning, however, he was in for some unpleasant news. His secretary, with an anxious expression on his face, informed him that Mikhail Antonovich's personal driver had been dismissed yesterday, not by his order, but by the decision of his son. Mikhail Antonovich was puzzled and dissatisfied. The driver had been with him for many years, he trusted him as a professional and a man, and he did not understand why Alexei, without consulting him, had decided to dismiss Sergei. Irritated and outraged by such arbitrariness, Mikhail Antonovich immediately demanded an explanation. After a short questioning, he learned that Alexei considered the driver guilty of his failure to make the flight and made a hasty decision to dismiss him on the spot without notifying his father. This behavior of his son caused Mikhail Antonovich a storm of emotions. He could not understand how Alexei could so easily dispose of the fate of a man who for many years faithfully and truthfully served their family. Mikhail Antonovich was a man of the old school, valued loyalty, and such actions of his son were unacceptable to him. Without a moment's hesitation, Mikhail Antonovich immediately ordered the driver to return to work. He personally called Sergei and asked him to come. When Sergei returned, Mikhail Antonovich met him in his office, apologizing for the misunderstanding and for his son's actions. "It was a mistake, and I take it upon myself," he said with sincerity in his voice. "You've been with us for many years, and I won't let one unpleasant event jeopardize your future." The driver, though shocked by the situation, thanked Mikhail Antonovich for his decency and went back to his duties, feeling relieved that everything was back to normal. Alexei, meanwhile, was completely unaware that his order had been ignored. He was enjoying his vacation in the Maldives, not thinking about business and not knowing that his father had decided to reinstate the driver he had fired. He had no idea that his father fundamentally disagreed with his decision. Alexei was absorbed in the atmosphere of luxury. Morning walks on the white sands, swimming in the warm ocean, dinners in the best restaurants of the resort. He felt like the master of his life, absolutely sure that everything was going as he had planned. A week passed, and Alexei returned home just before his birthday. He was in a good mood, full of impressions from the trip. A car was waiting for him at the airport, but what was his shock when he saw the very driver he thought he had fired behind the wheel. Sergei, with a polite smile, greeted Alexei as always, opened the car door and offered to help him with his luggage. Alexei froze for a moment, not believing his eyes. All his thoughts and plans fell apart in 1 second. The driver, whom he had so easily cut out of his life, was there as if nothing had happened. Alexei's birthday had arrived and, as always, he decided to throw a lavish party that would be discussed in the highest circles for a long time to come. Alexei invited not just his friends, but key business players with whom he wanted to demonstrate his power and influence. Among the guests were successful entrepreneurs, owners of large companies, and people known in society. Alexei planned for this evening to be a true celebration of his status, his achievements, and the strength he had accumulated over the years. The suit he chose for this event was not just expensive, it was a symbol of his success. Every detail had been thought out to perfection. It was made to order from the rarest fabrics imported from Italy and cost a fortune, about as much as his driver earned in a year. Alexei admired himself in the mirror, feeling himself the king of the evening. The suit did not just emphasize his high social status, it was a symbol of his superiority over others. He felt that this evening all eyes would be on him, and his friends and colleagues would once again be convinced of his importance and power. However, behind all this external luxury there was another motive. Alexei had planned something special for this evening, something that would emphasize his control over people and show the guests who was in charge. Among the invitees was Sergei, the driver whom Alexei had recently tried to fire. But this time Alexei planned not just his presence at the party, he wanted to make him an example for others. The idea of humiliating the driver in front of a crowd of influential people seemed great to him. In his mind, Sergei was to be a kind of symbol, a confirmation that Alexei could manipulate anyone in his life. Alexei saw this moment in detail. He imagined how all his friends, successful businessmen and millionaires, would look at the driver with contempt and surprise, while he himself would stand in the center of this attention, enjoying their reactions. That's how you should deal with those who don't listen to you, he thought to himself, imagining how these words would sound in his speech to his guests. Alexei was going to put on a little show to demonstrate his power over people, even those who had served his family for years. Alexei was looking forward to this moment, enjoying the attention of those around him and feeling centered. Like the true host of the evening, he took the microphone, correcting it in his hand, and looking at the gathered guests, said with a grin, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the moment you have been waiting for. Our main guest is about to appear." Alexei's words caused a stir in the hall. There were laughs and quiet comments. Everyone in the hall understood that it was about the driver whom Alexei intended to humiliate, and the anticipation of the spectacle caused a great excitement among the guests. Champagne was flowing, laughter and banter grew louder and louder, creating an atmosphere of all-round fun. Alexei, bathed in this attention, felt more confident than ever. His heart pounded in the rhythm of the holiday. He enjoyed every second of anticipation. "Where is he?" came a voice from the crowd, causing a new burst of laughter and cheers. The guests glanced around, not hiding their anticipation, and each moment grew more tense. But what happened next took everyone by surprise. The door of the restaurant opened and the driver entered the hall, but not alone. Next to him walked Mikhail Antonovich, his father, confident and calm, with a hard expression on his face, which said that he was not going to tolerate further humiliation. Unlike the guests, who still hadn't realized the gravity of the situation, he didn't allow himself a smile. His presence suddenly changed the atmosphere in the hall, and the shouts of merriment gradually subsided, giving way to silent expectation. There was a sepulchral silence in the hall, and all eyes were instantly drawn to the stage where Alexei was standing. The driver, staying next to Mikhail Antonovich, looked silent, but his gaze was full of dignity and confidence, as if he knew that he had come not just as a subordinate, but as a person who deserved respect. At that moment, Alexei realized that his flat jokes and arrogance could backfire on him. Excitement and fear began to intertwine in his mind, and he could no longer be sure that the evening would end the way he had planned. Alexei couldn't believe his eyes. He was as shocked as everyone else in the room. His father, always wise and reserved, never interfered in his personal affairs, especially so publicly. The silence that followed Mikhail Antonovich's appearance seemed oppressive. Whispers were heard in the hall, as if the guests began to realize that the evening, which was supposed to be a celebration, had suddenly turned into something else. A sense of awkwardness and anxiety hung in the air as some of the invitees exchanged looks full of bewilderment, and some were beginning to feel that the situation was getting out of control. Mikhail Antonovich slowly raised his hand, calling for silence, and, as if everyone around him was holding their breath, asked for a microphone. Alexei, petrified with surprise, handed it to his father without uttering a word. His heart was pounding in his chest, and excitement gripped him as never before. Mikhail Antonovich, taking the microphone, looked at his son with a stone face and said, "Alexei, come here." At that moment the hall became completely quiet. No one laughed, no one joked, everyone froze in anticipation. The guests could not take their eyes off what was happening, and tension was in the air. Alexei reluctantly moved towards his father. His steps were heavy, as if he didn't realize what was waiting for him. Every movement was difficult, and his heart seemed about to jump out of his chest. It was hard for him to imagine what might follow, but he still hoped that his father had simply decided to teach him a lesson, that Mikhail Antonovich would confine himself to words. The reality, however, was much harsher than he could have imagined. As soon as Alexei came close enough, Mikhail Antonovich suddenly, with full force, hit him in the face with his fist. The blow was so powerful and unexpected that Alexei did not have time to react. His head flew sideways, and he immediately collapsed to the floor. There was a deafening silence in the hall where the fun had just reigned, and then it was replaced by a wave of surprised whispers. Some of the guests gasped, shocked by what had happened, and someone even involuntarily stood up from his seat, not knowing how to react to such a scene. Mikhail Antonovich, paying no attention to the confusion of those around him, bent over his son, who was lying on the floor, pressing his palm to his face in an attempt to suppress the pain. In the silence, which was broken only by the whispers of those present, he said quietly, but so that everyone could hear, "You are not a king, Alexei, and you never will be." These words sounded like thunder, resonating in the heads of the guests. An oppressive atmosphere hung in the hall, and some began to realize that this was not just a random incident, but a moment that would be a turning point in their perception of Alexei and his family. Alexei lay on the floor, feeling his world turn upside down, and realized that he would no longer be able to escape the consequences of his arrogance. After these words, Mikhail Antonovich rose again and, turning to the guests, raised the microphone. "The party is over. Everyone is free to go." The guests looked at what was happening in complete shock, as if they had witnessed some theater of the absurd. Those, who a few minutes ago were laughing and supporting Alexei in his desire to humiliate the driver, were now confused and did not know how to react to this radical change of mood. Their eyes darted from Alexei to his father, fear and bewilderment mixed in them. No one had expected such a turn of events, and there was a tense whisper in the air. "What have we just seen?" Mikhail Antonovich's words left no room for doubt. They pierced the silence like a shot in the darkness. One by one the guests began to rise from their seats, trying not to look at Alexei, and left the restaurant quietly, almost singly, as if each of them felt himself a part of some shameful spectacle. Some looked back at Alexei with pity or incomprehension, some cast glances at his father, but no one dared to say a word. They realized that it was not just a family scene, but a moment in which Mikhail Antonovich, leaving no chance for his son, put an end to Alexei's claims to power and influence. When the last guest left the room, only Mikhail Antonovich, the driver, and Alexei remained in the restaurant, still sitting on the floor as if stuck in time, trying to recover from the shock and understand what had just happened. His father looked at him once more, his eyes expressing a combination of frustration and determination, but Mikhail didn't say a word, and without waiting for a response, headed for the exit. The driver, who had just become a victim of his employer's ruthless game, silently followed him, leaving Alexei alone among the empty tables and forgotten glasses, like a ghost in a hall full of memories of the former fun. Mikhail Antonovich had no intention of continuing the conversation. For him, this evening was the final point in his relations with his son, which had long ago given a crack. He understood that Alexei, despite his success and wealth, had not learned important life lessons, that he was stuck in his self-centered world, surrounded by luxury, where power and money overshadowed true values. With each step toward the exit, Michael felt that this moment not only revealed his son's true colors, but was an important lesson for himself. It was his way of showing that money and power were not all that made a man worthy, and that respect, decency, and humanity were the qualities that really mattered in life. Alexei, who remained in the empty hall, sat motionless, his thoughts in chaos. He could not understand how in one evening all his carefully planned plans and hopes had collapsed like a house of cards. Memories of the driver, who had just calmly accepted his father's apology, flashed through his mind like vivid images from a movie in which the main character suddenly found himself out of place. Alexei felt completely powerless for the first time in a long time. His heart clenched with the bitter realization that he had undermined his own authority. He remained seated in the empty hall for a while longer, as if hoping that everything would fall into place in his mind, as if in a scattered jigsaw puzzle. He was used to being in control, used to people around him obeying him without question and willingly following his orders. However, this evening showed him that power and money cannot solve all problems, and sometimes even exacerbate them, forcing him to face the harsh reality that Alexei had so far preferred not to think about. A few days later, when the shock of what had happened had subsided a little, Alexei learned that his father, Mikhail Antonovich, and the driver had known each other for a long time. It turned out that the driver had been working for Mikhail Antonovich for 15 years, and during this time they had not only established business relations, but had become really close, as longtime friends who had gone through many trials together. The driver more than once helped Alexei's father in difficult situations, sometimes even risking his own life. These facts turned his perception of the driver upside down, revealing a new, deeper facet of their interaction. Alexei recalled his father's story about those times when Mikhail Antonovich was a young entrepreneur just starting his way in business. Those were hard times, when competition was fierce and business was conducted in constant danger. One day Mikhail Antonovich was threatened, and it came to the point where he was chased by his enemies as they tried to avenge his success. Then the driver, keeping his cool and showing outstanding driving skills, managed to drive the car away from the pursuers at high speed, saving the life of his employer. This story, full of tension and courage, once seemed to Alexei only a bright but insignificant tale from the past, now played with new colors and was filled with true meaning. He began to realize that the driver was not just an employee for his father, but a faithful friend and protector whom Mikhail Antonovich trusted unconditionally. Alexei realized that his attempt to humiliate this man in front of the guests was not only cruel, but also deeply unfair, destroying everything that his father valued in his relations with people. At that moment, it became clear to him that respect and trust were not just words, but important components of a real relationship, and he had made a serious mistake in thinking of the driver as a mere servant. This thought made Alexei think about his own values and how he built his relationships with others. Alexei's father did not make an additional showdown after that evening, but he did take action. Mikhail Antonovich decided that his son should learn to live on more modest terms than he was used to. He significantly reduced Alexei's funding, leaving him only the amount that corresponded to the salary of an ordinary janitor. Alexei was shocked by this decision, because all his habits, his whole way of life depended on large sums of money. He had no savings, and the thought that he would have to start living from scratch filled him with anxiety. Now, left with virtually no funds, Alexei found himself in a new reality. He could no longer afford expensive dinners at restaurants, prestigious entertainment, or even daily cab rides. His spending had become very limited, and this made him rethink his attitude toward money and toward people. He felt how important it was to know the value of every ruble, when every morning he had to count how much money he had left to buy something to eat or a bus ride. At first, Alexei was angry with his father. He thought that such punishment was too cruel, that his father was trying to break his will. This rage overwhelmed him, and he looked for ways to vent his discontent, but soon realized that this would lead to nothing good. However, with each day spent in his limited circumstances, Alexei began to realize that his former life had been built on excesses and empty vanity. He began to think about how he used his position, how he treated people, and why he so easily allowed himself to disregard other people's feelings. His pride gradually gave way to humility, and he began to analyze his past actions with a new perspective. Several months passed. Alexei learned to live more modestly and even discovered that there were advantages to it. He began to realize that simplicity and independence from other people's opinions brought more inner peace than luxury and ostentatious life. He began to walk more often, enjoying simple pleasures such as fresh air and the sounds of nature, and even began to socialize with people he had not seen the need to get to know before. One thing, however, kept him uneasy: his relationship with the driver, which he had destroyed by his actions. This thought tormented him like a pinching feeling of guilt. Alexei had seen the man several times on the grounds of his father's house. Each time they met eyes, Alexei felt awkward and ashamed. The driver seemed to be still as calm and focused as ever, but in his eyes Alexei read something more: understanding, sympathy, and maybe even some resentment. He realized that that evening had left an unpleasant residue not only in his life, but also in the life of this man, and it seemed that every glance of the driver reminded Alexei of his mistake. He struggled with himself for a long time, not knowing how to start the conversation, what to say to express his sincere regrets, and finally decided. One day, having come to his father's house on business, Alexei saw the driver, who, as usual, was busy with business near the car. He was washing the hood, preparing the car for another trip, when he noticed Alexei, and for a moment their gazes met. Alexei felt his heart clench with excitement, but this time, instead of averting his eyes, he took a step forward. He realized that he needed to act. Overcoming internal barriers, he approached him slowly, gathering his thoughts into a pile, and spoke, trying to make his voice calm. "Hello, I need to talk to you." "Hello," Alexei said hesitantly, stopping a few steps away from the driver. He raised his head and looked at Alexei, nodding silently in greeting, but not abandoning his work. There was no malice or contempt in his eyes, but there was no warmth in them either. He was just waiting to see what Alexei would say next. Alexei sighed heavily and took a step closer. "I wanted to talk to you," he said, nervously interlacing his fingers. "About what happened at my party." He was silent for a moment, not knowing how to choose the right words. "I was wrong, very wrong, and I'm ashamed of what I did." The driver looked at him carefully, as if assessing his words. "I didn't expect you to apologize," the driver replied, straightening up. "But if you really realized your mistake, that's good." Alexei nodded, feeling that the weight from his soul was lightened a little, but he wanted to say more. "I've realized a lot in the last few months," he continued. "I realized that I'd been blind and arrogant. You deserved respect, and I acted like a fool. I'm sorry." The driver looked at him again, but this time his gaze was softer. "I forgive you, Alexei. Everyone makes mistakes in life. The important thing is that you learn from it." Alexei felt that this was an important moment for him. His apology was accepted, but more important was that he really began to realize that in life it is important not only position and money, but also human relations, respect for people who surround you. Over time, Alexei began to change. He no longer aspired to ostentatious luxury and did not try to prove his importance through money. Relations with his father also began to recover. Mikhail Antonovich saw that his son really revised his views on life and began to regain his trust. Alexei no longer looked down on people. He learned to appreciate the labor of others, to understand that every person, regardless of status or position, has its own value and dignity. The driver, whom he had once wanted to humiliate, became for him a symbol of inner strength and endurance, something Alexei himself lacked. His father continued to cut his funding, but Alexei no longer saw it as a punishment. He began to work on himself, engaged in projects that brought him pleasure, and strived for success not for the sake of status, but for self-realization. At some point he realized that money was just a tool, not the purpose of life. Several years passed, and Alexei became a mature, realized man. Now he could be proud of himself not for his wealth or influence, but for the fact that he had managed to change, learn to respect others, and began to understand life better. I want to apologize for any mistakes in the text or dubbing. I'm just learning, and the language of this channel is not my mother tongue. The dubbing is done with the help of artificial intelligence. Please point out errors so I can fix them and improve the quality of the content. Also, I will be glad if you share your thoughts on the topic. Your support in the comments is very motivating for me to keep looking for new, interesting stories. Thank you for your understanding and participation. Subscribe to the channel and put a bell to not miss new stories.